Over the next few minutes, I'll show you what photographic filters are all about, which ones are available, when you would typically want to use them, and, most importantly, how to use them effectively. Put simply, filters are pieces of glass or plastic which are placed in front of a lens to influence the light entering the camera. By using filters, all we're basically doing is editing the image before it's even been captured by the camera. There are many different filters available for the photographer, but many of them are just a bit gimmicky, and most of them can be replicated by software at the editing stage. There are two, however, which cannot be replicated by software: the polarizer and the neutral density filter, or otherwise known as an ND filter, if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about. Let's look at the polarizer first. What these do is they reduce reflections from shiny surfaces. There's no Photoshop equivalent that will allow you to do this, so if you want to remove reflections, it needs to be done with a polarizer at the capture stage. Polarizers block about 70% of the light, which means they reduce the exposure by just under 2 stops. This brings us nicely on to the neutral density filter, which have the sole purpose of reducing the amount of light entering the lens. ND filters come in many strengths, right down to 16 stops, which let through so little light that you cannot see through them. They look totally black. In a moment, we'll look at some examples as to why you might want to reduce the amount of light entering a lens. But before we do that, we'll also look at this. This is a neutral density graduated filter, which is essentially half ND, half clear, otherwise known as a split ND. These are essentially the same as ND filters, but allow the photographer to apply the effect to only part of the image. Let's start with a polarizer. Now, many photographers will keep a polarizer attached to their lens at all times, but this is not good practice. As with all filters, polarizers should only be used when they're necessary. You only want to be using a polarizer when you want to reduce reflections from shiny surfaces. In a landscape environment, this is often on water, but sometimes we take a landscape photo purely because of a reflection. So in this situation, the last thing you would want to do is use a polarizer to reduce that reflection. In this example here, you can see the reflection on the rocks is being affected as I rotate the polarizer on the front of the lens. The polarizer on the Kase K9 filter holder doesn't rotate as you twist the actual holder itself, so if you want to angle filters, you don't need to reset the polarizer afterwards. Be careful when using a polarizer on a wide-angled lens, as you will get an uneven effect across the frame due to the varying angle of light. If using a longer focal length lens, then all the light tends to be of a similar angle and is therefore affected to a similar degree by the polarizer. Now, let's look at when you're going to want to use an ND filter. In a landscape environment, what these do is they allow us to achieve a longer exposure time than would be possible without one. So in bright conditions, this is perfect for recording movement in the water. Think of an ND filter a bit like a pair of sunglasses for your lens. It's just reducing the amount of light entering the camera. Take this situation as an example. It's a bright day and I want to record some movement in the waves, which is going to require an exposure time of around 1 second. However, even with the lens at its smallest aperture and the ISO at its lowest setting, the longest exposure time I'm able to achieve without overexposing the highlights is 1/15 of a second. This is where the ND filter comes in handy. By using a 6-stop ND filter, I'm able to increase my exposure to 1 second and record the desired movement in the water. This was only made possible by the use of an ND filter, so they really are handy to have in your bag. By using stronger ND filters, it's possible to get exposure times of several minutes, even in the middle of a bright day. Such long exposures can be used to record movement in slower moving elements, such as clouds. So that just leaves us with the ND grad, or split ND. Now, these are really useful when you have two different parts of a scene at very different exposures. And typically when you're shooting into the light at dawn or dusk, you have a very bright sky and a very dark foreground because we're looking at the shadow side of the foreground. And the two are very far apart in terms of exposure. Positioning an ND grad down in front of the lens at the right point where the sky meets the foreground can help balance out that exposure and bring everything within the range of the camera. ND grads can slide up and down to allow the gradient to be aligned perfectly with the horizon, and they can be angled in case your horizon is not level. They come in different strengths, with the most useful being 2 or 3 stops, but they also come in different gradients too. A hard grad will go from full density to no density very abruptly, whereas a soft grad's gradient will be more subtle over a greater distance.
Hard grads are better for situations where you have a definite and straight horizon, such as a seascape, whereas soft grads are better suited for less defined horizons, such as hills, or if you have a foreground object protruding into the sky, such as a tree.
If you want to take your photography seriously, then a comprehensive filter set is definitely something you should have in your bag.
In today's digital world, where it's possible to take multiple exposures of the same scene and then blend them together in the computer afterwards, some photographers don't see the point in ND grads. If this is you, then you'll still want a polarizer and ND filters, but rather than buying into a square modular system where each filter slots in, you can go for a circular system, such as this magnetic one from Kase filters, which simply allows the filters to snap on and pull off easily.
I hope this brief introduction to filters has been useful to you. Before I go, I just want to leave you with one final point, and that is the secret to using filters is knowing when not to use them. Just because you have a set of filters in your bag doesn't mean to say you have to use them for every single shot you take. It's knowing when to use them that will really help the creativity of your photography.